This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
And we are back with another episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. I am Brad Kelly. This is Kevin Kautzman. Hi, Kevin. How are you? How are you doing?
Howdy. I got a new studio. I'm very excited.
Studio. Yeah.
And we're coming at you in our usual setup, except for that. The last time Brad and I spoke was for Patreon only.
Yeah.
And it was live. We were coming from the woods. Yeah.
We did it live. We did it in the woods. That was before the werewolf attack.
It was during our annual corporate retreat / trust exercise that we do. The entire thing is a trust exercise, and we're constantly falling into each other's arms, letting the other guy slip, trying not to get into car accidents.
You want to make sure that you want him to trust you, but not too much.
Right.
So you got to keep it that perfect balance. Yeah,
we got to keep each other sharp for the foul year of our Lord 2023 is caroming toward a conclusion. And but during that trip that I took up to the Bradlands in northern Michigan, we planned season 4.
We did plan.
You can hear that discussion if you sign up for Patreon at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. This is a core episode we've got coming at you today, and we've got another core episode queued up for tomorrow.
Yeah,
so
going hard.
Buckle up. Art of Darkness coming in hot.
Yeah, if you're subscribed to us, and you should be subscribed to us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you subscribe to podcasts, you may have thought, hey, these guys are usually drop episodes every 15 minutes. What's going on here? Well, hold on, because it's coming at you hot and heavy here in September. So
that that dovetails into something I want to say, and I want to get out of the way. The subscriber numbers are hot. We're doing really, really well. Patreon also doing well, could always be doing better. And I have a call to action for folks. Ooh. If you've smashed that subscribe button, if you smashed that like button, if you've left a review on Spotify, if you've clicked that button that jams us into your feed in Spotify, and you are a recurring listener, I am asking you to go over to Patreon, do the bare minimum, and subscribe there. If every single person who is subbed right now, thousands of people on Spotify, if they were to go over to Patreon and sign up, it would be lights out, good game, life-changing for the pod.
Yeah.
So if you think that this podcast is worth subbing to, if you have, you're getting us in your ear holes in a regular way, what is stopping you from going over to Patreon and doing it? I don't know. Is it the $5 a month? I was thinking about this when I was hanging out with Brad in Northern Michigan. What's $5 a month now? That is one of those crummy iced coffees that you get at the gas station.
Yeah, you can't even get like a Starbucks Frappuccino for that.
You go to the gas station and you go, I'm going to try one of these iced coffees. Maybe they've figured the formula out. Maybe it's gotten better. Maybe it actually is worth $4.80 for a can with the little siren and the crummy iced coffee in it.
Yeah,
and it's never satisfying. You always regret it. You will not regret put that Starbucks iced coffee back and instead pull out your phone and subscribe to the best podcast about the dark side of creativity that exists and that will ever exist. Help us make this show better.
Yes.
I'm trying to plant this seed into people's minds. If you're subscribing, you're getting something for nothing. Consider the value of what you get here. Consider what we're doing for Patreon. Every new Patreon subscriber, a lot of good things come out of that. Brad and I get a little more slack. We get a little more headspace so we can think more about the pod. We want to do more cool things for Patreon. We already have the After Dark episodes. We already have the book club. We're thinking about other cool things we might start doing for Patreon only. I would hope if we didn't do a damned thing for Patreon, out of the goodness of your heart, you would think, I'm going to give these guys, $5-10 a month just for what they do. What we're about to drop on you here, Brad's going to tease what we're going to do here for the core episode in a minute. It's going to be 4 or 5. Who knows how long we'll go? Yeah. And we do 2 of these on average a month, 24 episodes a year. It's a lot. So consider, value for value. What value do you get out of this podcast? It takes you 5 minutes to sign up at Patreon, and then you're done. You're supporting the pod. Brad and I are happy. The pod grows. The other thing that people may not know this is kind of deep lore for Art of Darkness, but every new Patreon subscriber who sticks with the pod, through the power of the inner tubes and internet magic, every new Patreon subscriber magically resolves an artist's mommy and or daddy issue.
Yeah.
A living artist right now is having mommy or daddy issues.
Yes.
You go and you subscribe, and they just get a little bit of karmic juice, a little bit of zhuzh. And maybe they forgive their father for missing the dance recital. Maybe the soccer mom, gone too soon, rest in peace. They're able to find peace with her. She didn't support their Hunter S. Thompson phase. She didn't understand.
Yeah.
And there's an artist out there whose heart is still kind of broken. If you go and subscribe to Patreon, that you just put a little karmic energy out there and you help the living artists. We don't know how it works. It's very mysterious.
No. Well, and we're about to talk about Carlos Castaneda, and we're about to talk about some real magic, and makes me think about something that Carlos Castaneda might ask a person is your path a path of the heart? And subscribing on Patreon, that is the path. That at least that part of your path is a path with heart, I would say.
I like that you were able to get in the subject that we're talking about. I'll stop harping on Patreon after I say one more thing. There was a story that went around recently about the obscene amount of money that Spotify has spent on podcast studios, on fake podcasts that nobody listens to, on Drek. And what is it? Is it money laundering? Is it blackmail? Is it a tax write-off? What do they do? Nobody knows. Right? We legitimately are a team of 2 coming at you from St. Paul, Minnesota, Detroit, Michigan, and then we have the great Peniel Collada, who does the show art. That's it. Yeah. I mean, and really. And then you are listeners. And even if you don't subscribe, we do love that you invite us into your homes, invite us into your your BDSM dungeons, wherever you're listening to Art of Darkness. We genuinely appreciate it, but it's at a certain point, you got to flip the script and you got to put that dollar value on it, because let's be real. This is how the world works. I mean, if you want 5 more years of Art of Darkness, 10 more years of Art of Darkness, you're going to have to put the money on the line, lay it out there, let us know you value it. And for those who do, we appreciate it. All right, let's get into Castaneda, Brad.
Yeah, well, we'll start with it. I mean, we'll start with the classic Art of Darkness question. Kevin, what do you know about Carlos Castaneda?
I don't know a damn thing. I think he's an author, an American author.
Yeah.
And I recall from my time working in a used bookstore that he's woo-woo. Woo-woo, wacky wackadoodle, woo-woo, 60s, 70s.
You don't get much more woo-woo than Carlos Castaneda.
Counterculture, but never really caught my eye. It was never anything that I got into, and I'm prepared to be Castaneda pilled. Okay. I wanna go on a path of the heart, Brad.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited for what you're gonna bring to us on this core episode. And for those who are new to Art of Darkness, we always have new listeners. This is the heart of the show. This is the core of the show. Every month or so, Brad prepares a core episode, educates me, and vice versa. I prepare an episode, educate Brad. Along the way, you get exposed to an artist who's been dead for at least a year. You get exposed to a dead artist who you probably ought to know. And we have some laughs along the way.
Oh, plus don't forget, multiple 2 or 3 darkroom episodes every month with some of the most interesting people floating around the internet. Fascinating conversations. Some of those episodes are quite popular. We've got a whole slate of them coming up, so you're never going to run dry of Art of Darkness content to listen to, I don't think.
Right, and this is season 3. Season 4 starts, with the new year, and we've had a hell of a lot of fun. But it also feels like we're just getting started. Yeah, and that, my friends, is the sweet spot. Also, don't forget our Telegram chat is very fun. If you want to get at us, if you want to chat with other Art of Darkness fans, go to t.me/Art of Dark Pod. Let's get into Castaneda, Brad. What do you got? Yeah.
So let me just restart with a quote. This is this is actually a quote from Carlos Castaneda's most famous book, his first book, The Teachings of Don Juan. Go ahead.
I think this is why I never got into him. Can you show the book for people who are on YouTube? That's papyrus font, isn't it?
Oh, I'm sure, but this isn't Carlos Castaneda's book. This is a book about him.
Nevertheless, he's kind of a papyrus adjacent type of a writer. I'm very judgmental. I do judge a book by its cover. Do you have any idea how much the publishing industry spends on covers?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Quite a lot. Go on.
So let me just read this passage, and then I'll give you then we'll launch into the story. But I wanted to give us a flavor of what you might encounter reading some Carlos Castaneda. This is from his first book, which we're going to see launched him into the stratosphere when this book came out. And here's a quote from it. And this is a quote. The book is called The Teachings of Don Juan. Don Juan, who we're going to talk about a lot. Let's just say Don Juan is, how to even phrase who Don Juan is without getting super deep into it. This is purportedly, what I'm about to read isn't actually Carlos Castaneda's words. It's actually Don Juan's words. And this is going to get complicated, but we're going to go into all of it. So, quote, "Look at every path closely and deliberately. Try it as many times as you think necessary. This question is one that only a very old man asks. And that question is, for what are we searching? My benefactor told me about it once when I was young, and my blood was too vigorous for me to understand it. Now I do understand it. I will tell you what it is. Does this path have a heart? All paths are the same. They lead nowhere. They are paths going through the bush or into the bush. In my own life, I could say I have traversed long, long paths, but I am not anywhere. My benefactor's question has meaning now. Does this path have a heart? If it does, the path is good. If it doesn't, it is of no use. Both paths lead nowhere, but one has a heart, the other doesn't. One makes for a joyful journey as long as you follow it. You are one with it. The other will make you curse your life. One makes you strong, the other weakens you." Okay, so one question I want you to be thinking about as you listen to this is Carlos Castaneda's path a path of the heart? It's an interesting question as we tell this story. Um, I can't overstate the influence of Carlos Castaneda. I think it's easy in 2023 for us to sort of forget it. And we're going to understand why we have a sort of a cultural amnesia about Carlos Castaneda, but his influence is enormous. And I've just got a list of random people here, and some you might expect. Deepak Chopra, of course. Stuart Brand, the guy who started the whole Earth catalog. Sure. William S. Burroughs wrote about Castaneda a lot. John Lennon, in his final interview, called Yoko Ono his Don Juan, which is a Carlos Castaneda reference. Countless guru type figures. But then other people you might not think of. Marvin Gaye believed in the idea of being an impeccable warrior, which is a Carlos Castaneda kind of meme. He had a huge influence on the director Federico Fellini. And we're going to tell the story in the After Dark for Patreon, patreon.com/darkpod, about what happened to Fellini when he fell into Carlos Castaneda's world. It is a crazy story. That's one of the things we're going to talk about in the After Dark. Tarkovsky, who we covered in a previous episode, desperately wanted to make a film about the teachings of Don Juan. The creator of The Sopranos, of all things, cites it as a major influence. Deleuze and Guattari compared the teachings of Don Juan, that book I just read from, to Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The founder of Google, Sergey Brin, cites Carlos Castaneda as a major influence. Rage Against the Machine cites Carlos Castaneda as a major influence. And the list, Bob Dylan said that Don Juan, from the teachings of Don Juan, brought in a new awareness/life force and wielded it like a machete. Oliver Stone was so influenced by Castaneda that he named his production company Itzlan after Carlos Castaneda's third book, Journey to Itzlan.
Is this the missing piece? Is this why I don't have a career? Like, what is going on here? Okay, I'm into this.
It's huge. And this is what I'm saying. There's like this weird, like, you say Carlos Castaneda, people are like, what? And it's like, you might not know him, but literally some hero of yours knows this stuff for sure.
Makes me think about Gurdjieff, where the Gurdjieff influence is everywhere. And I assume there's a thread here.
There is. There absolutely. And I'm glad you called that out. There absolutely is. There's an overlap, and Castaneda read Gurdjieff, no question about it. We're getting into woo-woo cult territory.
Yes, I love it.
Yes,
I love it
for sure.
Good.
So there's no doubt about it. Whatever you think about Castaneda, whether you think this is all hogwash, all woo-woo nonsense, he is one of the most important figures in the New Age movement of the latter half of the 20th century. And even if you think the New Age movement is a bunch of crap, its influence seeps into everything that happens right now. Right.
Oh yeah. So this stuff didn't go underground. It became the culture. It is the culture.
Yeah.
You got the soccer mom I mentioned before, rest in peace. She was manifesting all the way until she had the accident in the minivan.
Yes. Right.
She was. Yes. Yeah, we're all influenced by this. This is the water we swim in now.
100%. And if there's a Mount Rushmore of 20th century figures important to the New Age movement, Carlos Castaneda is on it.
Let's go.
Yeah. Now, he also is now remembered by the people who remember him mostly as a fraud and a huckster. Okay.
I see no problem with that.
Me neither. No.
when in Rome.
Right.
Yeah. I'm just, what is it? Because I want to fit in .gif.
Right. Just one last note before we launch into the story about the influence. These books of his sold 28 million copies. That's an ungodly sum of books. Like, there's only a handful of people who sell those kinds of numbers for sure. Like, you're talking like Stephen King sells more than that, but maybe 10 other people sell that many books. So huge influence. So who the hell was this guy? It's surprising how difficult it is, or it was at one time, to figure out who he was. Here is one of the first Americans who knew him personally. For a long time, this is who she thought he was. according to Margaret Runyon, who would be married to Carlos, Carlos was born in Italy on Christmas Day, 1931, and was the product of an illicit union between a 16-year-old student at a Swiss finishing school and a visiting Brazilian professor. Carlos was taken back to Sao Paulo by his maternal aunt to be raised, and at 15, he was expelled from a prestigious private school and spent the ensuing years traveling and studying art. During the Korean War, according to this narrative, Carlos Castaneda served in U.S. Army intelligence, and he had a scar that nobody knows where it actually came from for sure. He had a scar stretching from his abdomen to his groin. Now, there's no official records of him serving in the military in any capacity, but nobody knows what the scar came from.
Is it Army intelligence? Isn't that an oxymoron? Whoa, I had to do it. Ding, ding, ding. Had to go for the joke. Wait, he had a scar from where to where?
From his groin, from his somewhere in his abdomen to his groin. I imagine it being like under his sternum all the way to his groin.
Yikes.
And he would tell stories about how he got bayoneted and strung up, hung from his feet when he was serving in either Korea or Spain. But he had all kinds of crazy stories about the different things that he had done. He was born, depending on who he talked to, he was born in Brazil, he was born in Peru, he was born in Argentina. He was a Hasidic Jew, which doesn't make any sense at all. He told people all kinds of stories.
Flim flam
man par excellence. Maybe the best
flim flam
man. Now, so who was he actually? Okay, the nearest we can tell, and a lot of this work was done for a Time magazine article in the early 70s. Carlos Castaneda was born Carlos Cesar Salvador Arana Castaneda with a tilde over the N. He got rid of that later. He was born on Christmas Day, 1925, Cajamarca, Peru. His father, Cesar Arana Burungare, was an Italian watchmaker and goldsmith with family in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Castaneda, in rare moments of honesty, would talk about his father, saying, quote, "I despised my father beyond anything I could say, and at the same time, I loved him with a sadness that was unmatched." He did not like his father for a few reasons. One was his father never did the things he said he would do. And I want you to think about this later when we get into what Castaneda's ideas are about how you should live your life. He said his father never did the same things he said he would do. He was an intellectual, but he was a literary man who never wrote anything. Everything ran on schedule, but everything was mediocre and unworthy of note. Okay. So you just
feel like I'm being subtweeted here.
Castaneda's mother, Susana Castaneda Novoa, we don't really know much about her at all, except that Castaneda says that he never liked her. And that he would always tell people that she died when he was 6 years old, which was not true.
This is an artistic type of who could have benefited from some of that art of darkness karma that we have going around.
Yes.
We need to, see, this is why I talk about the mommy and the daddy issues. Yeah. This is fascinating because what year was he born?
1925.
This is highly unusual for the subjects we cover. Typically, when you get into the 20th century, people are very well documented. Mm-hmm. I'm preparing to do Dante. And we're talking about the 13th and the 14th centuries. And there's a lot about Dante, but there's a lot we don't know. And that makes sense. Somebody willfully maybe hid things or confused things.
And that person was Castaneda.
Okay. All right.
He did not want you to know his real deal. And we'll get into we'll get into how that actually fits into the philosophy he was espousing. There is this weird thing where as you look at Castaneda's life, you think, man, he was plotting this from day one somehow. Like it was somehow, you talk about manifesting. I'm not saying he was manifesting it, but like there is a sense of like a very long-term plan being carried out that started maybe in like as a teenager, maybe. It's very, very interesting. We don't know a ton about his childhood. There are some interviews with childhood friends of his, And I guess there's a point where I can talk about some of my resources right now. One resource, if you want to dive a little bit deeper, it's worth checking out. It's a podcast. It's a 12-part podcast about Castaneda called Trickster. There's a lot of good interviews with people who knew him. It's worth checking out. A big resource for me is going to be this book, The Life and Teachings of Carlos Castaneda, by a gentleman named William Patrick Patterson. It's quite good. I'll have, of course, a couple of Carlos Castaneda books that I'll be referencing. This short but interesting book called Shaman, The Mysterious Life and Impeccable Death of Carlos Castaneda by Mike Sager. And then this book, which I can't wait to talk about more in depth, The Don Juan Papers by Richard DeMille, who's actually the son of Cecil B. DeMille. Okay.
I'm ready for my close-up.
Yes.
Don Juan is ready for his close-up. Go, come on, Brad. You're directing.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we do know about Carlos Castaneda's boy. Let's just see if we can get a sense of him as a boy to the extent that we can, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's there's a story about going to the theater. He loved going to the movies and seeing American movies. Obviously, it's what you saw in the 30s and 40s. Is pretty much the only people who were making movies was either German movies or American movies. So he would go to the theater. And
Brad, you just pissed off a lot of people, but go on. You can get it
in the 1930s. Yeah,
you can find. Brad manages the Twitter account, which is at Art of Dark Pod. We don't pretend to get everything correct,
right.
But we're very accessible.
Let's just say there wasn't a enormous Peruvian film industry in the 1930s.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Now there's this thing that is really interesting, and it echoes something a specific thing that happens later. And remember, Trickster, right? That's the name of the podcast about his life. There's this scene of him being a boy sitting up sort of on the balcony in the movie theater, and he just decides that he's going to pee on the people below him. And the friend he's with is freaking out, like, they're kids. You're going to pee on somebody. They're going to beat us to death. Like, you can't just, and Carlos seemed, even as a boy, completely unperturbed by the potential consequences. And when the people came up and confronted him, he just said, I have no idea what you're talking about, and managed to convince them that he didn't have anything to do with it. Right. Just had a kind of thing where he could just look you straight in the eye, tell you something that's clearly not true, and you would just go, yeah, that sounds right. Okay, well, sorry to bother you. And
this guy is going to crush in the 1960s in the United States.
Yeah.
That's the kind of energy we need. That's the kind of energy that this country is built on. I'm going to piss in your face, and tell you straight to your face, I'm not pissing in your face.
Right. There's a thing later. He has this friend, Larry Watson. This is much later, but this is the echo of that story. When they're adults, he's like 30 something years old. They're standing in a stairwell. He's standing in a stairwell talking to his friend, and he tells Larry, he's like, I'm going to spit on that guy down there. And Larry's like, dude, what are you doing? Why? He's like, just watch. And he spits on him. And like, and he took some joy in the fact that he was going to be able to do that. And he would just be able to will himself out of the situation that happened.
Tremendously disgusting, however.
Right?
Sociopathic behavior.
It's something like, I couldn't imagine doing that to a random, like, it would. Yeah. Not only doing it even crossing your mind, really. Like, what are you?
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Very, very strange.
Yeah.
Now despite that kind of behavior,
if he keeps doing this, he's going to end up becoming a podcaster. He's got to be very careful. It's like you're watching your children for signs they're going to become a serial killer. They're like, arson, pissing on people, podcasting. Like, we got to get this kid some help.
Just down in the basement talking to his computer a lot.
He thinks he's talking to Joe Rogan. I don't know what's going on with him.
Now, despite this kind of behavior, he apparently had a lot of friends. And you'll see why. He's extremely charismatic. We're talking about S-tier charisma with this guy, and we'll see this come up time and time again. He went to the National Fine Arts School in Lima. He did want to be an artist early on. That seems to have been his intention. And friends recall him as witty, imaginative, and cheerful. One friend said he was, quote, a big liar and a great friend, which I think is just an interesting description. Just somebody to remember you fondly but also be like, yeah, he lied constantly. But I love the dude. Like that's a, it's just an interesting way to position himself.
Imagine him like in software sales in the 90s.
Right.
Would have made
Right.
bank.
Yeah, he would have. Yeah.
Get him into crypto now. Let's go.
Yeah. We'll see. He managed to make a few bucks as it happened.
I simultaneously like and detest this person at the same time already. We're not even 30 minutes in or whatever.
This is how I felt doing the whole episode. Just like sort of almost charmed by him, but also like just seeing him as like an enemy.
It's perfectly. That's exactly how I feel about the 60s.
right. Yeah. Now, there are some suggestions of some other things that he did when he lived in Peru. Apparently, he probably made a time. He may have made a living for a while selling medicinal herbs in the market of Cajamarca. And just think about, as we get into this story later, what that the kind of education he might have gotten doing that, and how it might have filtered into what he did later. When he's 24 years old, this is the official story, even though he told everybody his mother died when he was 6. When he was 24 years old, his mother died. He was so stricken by grief that he locked himself up in his room for 3 days. And basically, when he came out, he said, "I'm going to America." Right. So this was a big demarcation point in his life. His mother dying at the age of 20 when he was 24. It took him a little while to actually get to America, but he started setting everything in motion at this point. Margaret Runyon, the woman that he would be married to, had this to say: quote, "Carlos concluded that his attachment to his mother had been too strong, and the only way to avoid that in the future was to fight his notions of attachment and dependency." Okay, now think about, as I tell this story, think about his dependencies, his relationship to being dependent on other people. Like I said, it takes him 2 years before he actually takes off to America, and he happens to leave a pregnant fiance behind in Peru, and literally nothing is ever said about her again or the child.
Womp, womp, womp.
Yeah.
Going to hell.
Yeah.
Not a good move.
Not
Don't
great.
love that.
Then he gets to America.
Oh, no.
And he disappears from the public record for 4 years. No one has any idea what he was doing for 4 years. The first, literally, like, it doesn't matter. Nobody has any idea. There's things he said he was doing, but nobody actually knows. No work records, no anything.
I was working at the post office.
Yeah, right?
I was a furniture salesman. I was in New Orleans.
Right. Who knows?
That kind of vibe. It could
just
be
all kinds of things. And he would tell
4 years is a
things.
long time.
It is a long
Think
time.
about your own life and your own schedule. And we're talking about what? No proof of residence, no registration in a school.
Yeah.
Wow.
Time Magazine had a team of people working on this, and they couldn't figure it out.
That's kind of awesome.
Isn't it?
Yeah. This would be extraordinarily difficult to do now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, here, I'm going to give you a description of Castaneda in December of 1955. This is when he meets Margaret Runyon, the woman that he would be married to for a time. Quote, and she's describing Castaneda. Quote, "A short, dark man with black curly hair that gathered in a dangling cluster of tiny curls at the forehead. His eyes were large and brown, and the left iris floated out a bit, giving the impression that one eye was always looking beyond you. It was a flaw that he sought to hide by squinting quizzically or looking away, which made him seem painfully shy. He was not shy at all, but he had the look of a high countryman, short but slim, with an ample chest, thin eyebrows, a broad and ingratiating smile, and the how do you say this word, Kevin? Aquiline.
Okay,
okay, that's
I think so. Yeah,
aquiline nose of one with more than a random share of Indian genes. Okay, so that's a description of him. Now, he wouldn't get married to Margaret Runyon in 1960, and she's really the only source of pre-1960 post Peru pre-1960 information about Castaneda. All of it comes from the woman that he married, Margaret Runyon. He's living in Los Angeles. He is broke, dead broke, and he already is an enigma. Like, he's not Carlos Castaneda, whose names are on books or anything. He's a flat broke immigrant with no expertise or prospects whatsoever. And even at that time, he was so enigmatic that he drew people to him with like a gravity already, right? So just and this is the thing. Margaret Runyon wasn't just some random woman. She was a powerhouse. She was intelligent. She was capable. She'd been almost married to the writer Louis L'Amour, the Western writer. She had constant suitors all the time. She had worked her way up to being the chief telephone operator at Pacific Bell. She'd been married to she'd been engaged a number of times. She'd been married to some poet who I don't have the name of. She'd been married to like a real estate tycoon. She desperately did not want to be held down. And after her and Castaneda had like a little bit of a romance and he disappeared for 6 months, one day he shows up at her door. She's on a date with another guy in her apartment. He shows up at the door. She lets him in. He sizes up the other guy and he looks at Margaret and he says, "We're getting married." And they promptly get in the car and drive to Tijuana and get married.
Whoa.
So yeah. So I just like, the reason I tell this story is like, think about what kind of personality could make this happen, right?
Penetrating eyes, an aquiline nose, a foreign accent, probably very intelligent, mysterious. He knows all the PUA tricks without ever having to read a forum.
Right.
He disappears for 6 months. Very strong neg comes back.
Right.
We're getting married.
Right.
Like a magician, a Svengali.
He really is
a flim flam man of the highest order.
He really is. And this is the thing, even people who would kind of come to despise him or whatever, you know, they would always kind of give him credit and they would say, there's literally nobody better at reading a person than Carlos Castaneda.
Oh, wow.
Like he knew
X-ray,
it would take him
laser vision.
Yeah, 2 minutes and he would know your strengths and weaknesses and how to play them. You know, he just knew. And it gives me chills just thinking about that, because that's like a superpower that can be used for good or ill. Right. And we'll see how maybe it was used a little bit both ways.
Why not both?
Right. Exactly. Now, what else was he doing around this time, this pre-1960 era? He was very, very interested in what was at the time a new cultural phenomena, which was in the West anyway, which was psychedelic and plant-based drugs. He read everything you could read on the subject. He read The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. He read a book that was, funded by the CIA, called The Sacred Mushroom by somebody named Andrija Puharich. He read The Peyote Cult by Weston LeBar. And importantly, very important, and I want the audience to just remember this name if you don't already know it, because it's going to come up later. He read the work on mushrooms by R. Gordon Wasson. R. Gordon Wasson also features prominently in the Tim Leary episode that we did a while back. Now, with Margaret Runyon, Castaneda gets entangled in this narrative.
Hang tight here, because I have to say, you combine the X-ray vision, soul vision superpower that Brad described with psychedelics. Yeah, that is a recipe for epoch-changing potential.
Yeah. It's sort of like there's a little Charlie Manson vibe in there, a little bit, somewhat, right?
Yeah, that can break hard in any direction. You might start a band.
Right. Right.
You might have a band that's talented who takes some drugs and meets a guy like this, and then they go through the roof. They do something epoch changing. We'll be doing John Lennon at the end of the year here. So
yeah, absolutely. That's going to be great. Okay, so he 6 months after this marriage, they get married. I think they get married in 1960. Yes, I said that. You get married in 1960. 6 months later, Margaret Runyon says she wants a divorce. He's a little all over the place, right? And so all of the things that are sexy and appealing at first, it's kind of cool early on if you disappear for a while and then show back up. But like when you're married, it's like, wait, dude, like somebody was doing. I had to do all the like. Where were you?
Sure. You never call. You never write.
Very different thing.
Yeah.
Now, he told her that he filed for divorce because they got married in Mexico. He filed for divorce, but apparently he never did file for divorce until 1973. He just never got around to it. Here's another weird thing that happened.
I'm trying to think of him as like a D&D character, but for sort of modern American stats, right? It's just like charisma, 20 plus,
right?
Paperwork, 0.
Not very good.
No rules for paperwork. Not doing it. Botching paperwork all the time. Do you know anybody like that, Brad? I've got people in my life who are 0 paperwork people.
Yeah, I don't have 20 plus charisma, but man, I might have 1 or 2 paperwork. I'm not good on that. I'm not very good on that either. Here's a thing, a major life event that happens with this Margaret Runyon marriage. So for some reason, and he never explained why, and nobody knows exactly why, Carlos already had a vasectomy when he met Margaret Runyon, and yet he wanted her to have his child, and so they recruited a friend of his to impregnate her, and then Carlos adopted the child.
Oh,
yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa. Oh, what?
Yeah. So
well, that's not his child then, but
he adopted.
Okay.
His name is on the birth certificate. Carlos Castaneda's name is on
as
the
the father.
As the father, but it's not.
Did his friend have an aquiline nose?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Here's
the thing.
Bizarro turn.
It's very strange, right? And now you remember that physical description I gave you of Carlos, very, very dark. I mean, he's like half Peruvian, half Italian guy, right? So dark features. The boy was like a little blonde-haired boy. And he would take the kid around and be like, "This is my son." And people would be like, there's no way that's your son. And again, it added to the layer of mystique that he had, right? That he'd have this little boy and be like, "Yes, this is my son." And then it forces people to kind of go, "Wait, how?" Right?
I'm going to get ahead of this a little bit.
Yeah.
I hope that child was not as fucked up as I imagine he ended up being.
He was okay, I would say. We're going to talk a little bit more about him later. It's not totally fucked up, but it's not great.
We've had some characters. We've covered some characters on Art of Darkness who were not the greatest parents in the world.
Yeah.
So, okay.
He's Castaneda's. He's not. Well, this is the thing. He's not directly abusive.
Okay.
Right. So
good.
There's that.
That's good.
Yeah.
And hey, look, good for you. By the way, you want to have an unconventional family arrangement. I think we're entitled to kind of step back a little and say that's interesting. But also, do you want to have a surrogate? Go for it. I'm really not in a position to sit here and go, whoa, what's wrong with you? Right. As long as the child is the focus and you raise the child in a loving and considerate way.
Yeah. So far, leaving the pregnant fiance in Peru is much bigger crime than what he's got going on with Margaret Runyon and this child in America, for sure.
Still, we got an oddball here.
Yes.
We got an unusual, we got a quirky dude.
Yeah. And here's another thing too. He had some kind of sexual hang up that he never really talked about with Margaret and with these other women. And we're going to talk, there's a lot of women in Castaneda's life over time. With Margaret and with some of the other ones, the only sexual contact they would have for months to begin with was him performing oral sex. And it's,
sorry, this is hard to process because I have the entirety of The Sopranos flashing through my brain as you said that.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm at the part where the ducks, and then now I'm fine. Now the therapist is being assaulted.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
I know we forget about the Many Saints of Newark. That never happened.
Right.
What?
Yeah.
The many what's of Wait a minute. What?
Yeah.
So again, I'm entitled to be a little baffled here. This is very unusual.
Yes. There isn't anything about Castaneda's life that is normal at all.
I'm very curious.
So he would imagine he would
the women.
Maybe it was his hang up, or maybe it was part of his like long-term seductive plan, but he would harness all of his charismatic powers to get a woman. And then all he would do is go down on them. And I mean, if that's your thing, that's your thing, but it does seem a little odd, right? It's sort of like, is it like a physiological problem? Like why? Right? It's not clear. It's never really explained.
It seems like a joke without a punchline.
Something like that.
That's how I would describe that.
Yeah.
Lady listeners of Art of Darkness, we know you're out there.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you think of that?
I'm genuinely curious, not to be puerile or to solicit feedback we don't really want, but I am kind of curious. Like at a certain point, wouldn't that throw you off at a certain point?
Yeah. I mean, after a couple times, it would be like, wait, but you would just want to know why, right?
I think I would want to know why.
Right. Very strange. Nobody knows. Nobody knows the answer to this question. Maybe Margaret Runyon did.
I mean, maybe let's be generous to this fellow.
Yeah.
The scar, possibly. Could have been self-conscious about that.
Could be. But remember, he also had a vasectomy for some reason that he never explained. As a fairly young man, I mean, in his early 30s, and it's not like he'd had a bunch of kids and it was like time to shut the valve or something. Like
maybe he was just giga-based and he didn't want any of these women stealing his vril prematurely. He was gathering his vril so he could be more charismatic, so he could achieve whatever the hell he was on his way to achieving. I don't know.
I have a whole section of my notes that's sort of about that, but it comes later. We're going to get
Castaneda's a vril respecter. He's
I don't know that he ever used that word, but if he knew the concept, he would have been nodding his head. Yeah.
Orgone, Wilhelm Reich, that kind of territory. Okay, good.
Yeah. Now, another thing happens, a couple other things happen in 1960. This is when he's married and when they have the boy, CJ would be his name. And for a while, Castaneda is this boy's father. He does all the fatherly stuff, despite the fact that they're flat broke. She's doing fairly well, so that kind of, balances out the income. Another couple things happen. He starts going to college, which we're going to talk about quite a bit, and he simply stops writing letters home. He had been writing letters home all the time, and he just abruptly stops. He stops so abruptly that after a few years, and he'd weaved so many lies into his letters home that his family had no way to find out where he really was. They just assumed that he had died. So,
this guy's like a little microcosm of what's going to happen in the 60s to an entire generation of people.
Yeah.
You move from Dubuque to LA. You completely fall off the map.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the other thing, his family wouldn't have never called him Carlos Castaneda. They would have called him Cesar Arana. That was his name in Peru. That was what everybody called him. That's what everybody remembered him as. When a picture of him a public photo finally emerged, and there are very few photos of Carlos. When a picture finally emerges and people saw it back in Peru, it was like, oh, that's Cesar Arana. Or they'd be like, oh, this Carlos Castaneda guy looks exactly like our friend Cesar Arana. That's weird. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Now, 1960, as I said, he starts going to school. He enrolls in an undergraduate course in ethnography with a man named Clement Mahan. And this is a guy who had practically built UCLA's anthropology department. In this undergraduate course, Mahan says that if a student, it's an ethnography course, he says to his students, if you go out and interview an actual Indian, and I apologize for people out there if that's the word you think is offensive, I don't even know what to say anymore. He said, go out and interview an Indian, come back. If you really did it, you'll get an automatic A in this course. And so Castaneda says, okay, I will do that. Castaneda wanted to go bigger. He didn't want just an A in the course, though. He wanted publication. It would seem that Castaneda's goal at this time was that he was going to rise to the top of this field, ethnography, anthropology, whatever we want to call it, as fast as a person possibly could. And this is the thing we have to remember. He's already 35 when he enrolls he's not 22 or not 18, right? So there's a sense of playing catch up here. It's like he finally figured out the missing piece of the plan, and that was to skyrocket to the top of the world of anthropology. That was the plan.
Yeah, and somewhere an exclusively oral sex. Somehow these two things,
right?
At least he stopped pissing on people.
Yes. So now he would turn in a paper that very much impressed Clement Mion, and that paper would become the template for his first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge. Okay, now we're going to talk about this book a little bit. It doesn't come out until 1968, but it is the capstone of this whole 1960 to 1968 period. And it's just important that we actually get a sense of what this book is. It was Castaneda's master's thesis was this book, and it was billed as, and it still is sold as nonfiction, which, if you don't know anything about Castaneda, maybe that seems fine right now, but as we get through, that's going to seem very strange to you that you still buy this on the nonfiction shelf. It's purportedly documents a 5-year period that he spent studying Yaqui sorcery in the Sonoran Desert and parts of Mexico with an old, quote, man of knowledge. The word he uses for man of knowledge is a nahual, Nagual. The experiences he describes apprenticing to this man, this guy, Don Juan Matus, the experiences with Jimson weed or datura, peyote, and some kind of mushroom, along with the narrative about this young apprentice, Carlos Castaneda, learning the secrets of a universe, of the universe. This book, when it came out in 1968, was almost instantaneously in the lifespan of a book, a huge success. And as I said, it and its sequels would sell 28 million copies, right? So 1960, flat broke immigrant with a little adopted boy enrolls at UCLA. 1968, he is the biggest deal in the field of anthropology in the country, right? Okay. Now,
he was harnessing that vril for a reason. He had a master plan, and it involved UCLA and ethnography. I did not see this coming.
Yes.
Very unusual.
Yes. Now, this book is a bit like an adventure story. Okay. So Carlos, it starts and he meets Don Juan in a bus station, and there's sort of auspicious circumstances. And Carlos is very much positioning himself as sort of the fish out of water. Hey, I don't know anything about any of this stuff, the Don Juan kind of takes him under his wing and gives him first Jimson weed, which, if people are familiar with, this is a legitimate plant out there in the world that you could do, and you probably shouldn't unless you really know what you're doing. And I say this as a person who's not necessarily that averse to doing that sort of thing, but like, don't play with this one unless you have scoured the internet for every bit of information. And even then,
I feel like Obi-Wan Kenobi, that is a name I've not heard in a very long time. Jimson weed. And you know where I know it from is Hunter S. Thompson. Talked about Jimson weed. And I have no idea what it is or what it does. But
it's one of these plants. It's a datura, so it's a deliriant. It's one of these things you can take, and if you overdo it, you'll just wind up naked in a ditch somewhere, and you won't know what happened for the last 3 days. It's one of those kinds of drugs. The Jimson weed, which Don Juan doesn't like personally, his Carlos Castaneda's mentor doesn't like Jimson weed, but he wants Carlos Castaneda to develop his own relationship with it. Also peyote, under the influence of which Castaneda meets a plant spirit creature of wisdom that Don Juan calls mescalito. And then they work with some kind of powdered mushroom blend that is smoked from Don Juan's pipe, after which Castaneda has the experience of becoming a crow and flying around. Okay. These are some of the main sort of plot points of the book, right?
I've written the bestseller.
Yeah.
Give me all your money. Give me your women.
And you see the version of the book I've got has the crow on the front. That you'd have to imagine is Carlos Castaneda.
People ate this shit up in the
They loved
60s.
it.
They
Loved it.
needed this. The church was
They
going
did.
through a crisis. When is the church not?
Mhm.
Everybody was having like Vietnam was kind of in the air. You had the
Mhm.
Beatles happening. 1968, man.
Yeah. Wild, right? Yeah. I mean, here's some of the
You
other things that were
just
going
see
on
some
in 19.
young runaway from Nebraska in San
Yeah.
Francisco in a sundress in
Right.
some converted loft. And
Right.
And her boyfriend's strumming a guitar poorly over in the corner. They haven't bathed in a week.
Right.
She's got a copy of this cracked open.
Oh, well, and yeah, and
this is it.
Yeah, and if you're not super hip on like post-war American history, this is what some other events that happened in 1968. The Prague Spring, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, MLK was assassinated, worldwide student protests of Vietnam, RFK was assassinated, the famous Chicago Democratic Convention, Hair opens on Broadway, which actually was a big deal culturally. We forget that the Broadway show Hair. Andy Warhol was shot. The Black Panther Olympics protest. We orbited the moon. Not landed. We purportedly landed on it the next year. The Smithsonian has called the year 1968, quote, the year that shattered America. And this book fit right in with what was going on. So now here's the thing about this book. The general consensus nowadays, and you'll see some detractors, the general consensus nowadays is that the entire thing is a work of fiction. It's all bull. The whole thing.
Giga-based.
Don Juan, here's the general consensus.
Just it's Giga Chad.
Yeah.
Source. I made it up.
Right.
I saw it in a dream.
Yeah. Right. Don Juan was the that's exactly right. The consensus is Don Juan didn't exist at all. There's not even a guy. Carlos may have like once or twice met like some old medicine man kind of figure, but never was under any kind of apprenticeship. It's not clear that Carlos Castaneda even ever did any of these drugs. There's
what
only
rocks too is that this kind of person, the kind of person that forms their personality around a book like this, and then the pursuant threads that were to follow, doesn't give a damn whether it was real or not. That's the beauty of it. That's part of the beauty of it. It's what does it matter, man?
Right.
It's reality anyway, man.
Right.
You see that guy out there.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And well, yeah, we're going to talk about that as we get in here, because I'm going to show you how it came down to be proved that it was bull, right? But here's the important thing to remember. It was approved by the UCLA as a master's thesis. Not only that, his third book, Journey to Itzlan, was approved as a PhD dissertation. And that one was even more bullshit. So just think about that too, how he managed to play all of academia at the same time. He wasn't just, it's one thing to play, to manipulate and convince some, like he said, some teenager in Nebraska who wouldn't have any reason to second guess it. It's a book. It comes out from UCLA Press. It's on the nonfiction shelf. Like, why wouldn't it be true? But to literally get a review in the American Anthropology Review, like the premier magazine,
I love this.
Like, this is the most important book of anthropology of the year, maybe the century, right?
I love it. So listen, you can't be peer reviewed if you have no peers.
Yes. So let's talk about that's right. Let's talk about some of the reasons. Okay, we're going to talk about how he got away with it a little bit, but we also want to talk about why it caught on. I think we've kind of captured some of that. But a couple other things to think about. Again, hippiedom was in total full swing. I mean, the LSD revolution with Tim Leary is happening simultaneous with this. Castaneda claims that he met Tim Leary at one point and didn't like him. Who knows if that even happened? But this is really not just hippie stuff, because hippie is the whole sort of, for whatever issues you have with hippiedom as a cultural movement, its purported virtues were those of compassion and peacefulness, right? You can say that was all hypocrisy and all that's unworkable, but that's what it was trying to be. Don Juan and Castaneda are not pacifists. This was about becoming an impeccable warrior. This was about doing battle on this sort of the astral plane. It was a thing about strength and power and violence. It's not quite, it's the dark side of the hippie coin in some ways. So that's kind of interesting that that's happening at the same time.
Wait, you're telling me it wasn't all love and light?
No.
The motorcycle gangs were hanging around the corner,
right,
and all these people were waiting to get real estate licenses.
Right.
Got their own children out of the market in the very near future. You're telling me it was all bullshit, Brad? Is that what you're telling me? I'm gonna have to go. I wish I could go relive my 20s knowing this now.
Yeah, it would cast a different light on those things now, wouldn't it? Yeah. Now, I am going to, as we do this, I am going to make a case that there's certainly interesting stuff in these books. And I think there are things that are probably valuable sort of ways of looking at things at times. It's not particularly earth-shattering, perhaps. And you know, if you're listening to this episode and you know, you've listened to other Art of Darkness episodes, you know that primarily the people that we talk about are artists though they may be extremely innovative, they're artists in a conventional sort of sense. They wrote a novel, they directed a film, they made some albums, right? They did those kinds of things. What I want to pose Carlos Castaneda as is, think of him as one of the greatest performance artists of all time. And part of the performance is a series of books. Okay. Now, is there anything to these books? I would argue there is some interesting stuff in here. And I'm going to try to lay out some of the stuff that he's talking about. We're not going to go in depth. I mean, there's 12 books, and I'm not going to, some of it's kind of repetitive too. So we're not going to rehash every single thing he wrote, but I want to give you a sense of the kinds of things he's trying to tell you. So I'm going to read a little bit from the teachings of Don Juan, just a bit that I think is kind of an interesting framework. Where did it go? Yeah. Okay. So the whole books, the entire book is set up as a conversation mostly between Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda, interspersed with Carlos tripping on datura, peyote, or mushrooms.
Freaking rocks.
Yeah.
This was his master's thesis.
This was his master's thesis. Yes.
Man, we got to get back to this kind of thing. We really do. Right. This is, oh man, this is when things didn't feel quite so locked down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now here, let me give you a little part on, let me see. Here, let me start back here, actually. Sorry, this is an interesting bit of framework. And then I'm going to read some of the discourse about the actual drugs, which is interesting too. Quote, in our conversations, Don Juan consistently used or referred to the phrase man of knowledge, but never explained what he meant by it. So I asked him about it. Don Juan said, a man of knowledge is one who has followed truthfully the hardships of learning, a man who has, without rushing or without faltering, gone as far as he can in unraveling the secrets of power and knowledge. Can anyone be a man of knowledge? No, not anyone. Then what must the man do to become a man of knowledge? He must challenge and defeat his 4 natural enemies. Will he be a man of knowledge after defeating these 4 enemies? Yes. A man can call himself a man of knowledge only if he is capable of defeating all 4 of them. Then can anybody who defeats these enemies be a man of knowledge? Anybody who defeats them becomes a man of knowledge. But are there any special requirements a man must fulfill before fighting with these enemies? No. Anyone can try to become a man of knowledge. Very few men actually succeed. Okay. I said that part because think about how enticing that is to somebody out there who wants to change their life. Anybody can do it. All you have to do is defeat these 4 enemies, right?
Sounds very masculine too. The language is very
fight. Enemies. Yes. Yeah. This is a little bit later. When a man starts to learn, he is never clear about his objectives. His purpose is faulty. His intent is vague. He hopes for rewards that will never materialize, for he knows nothing of the hardships of learning. He slowly begins to learn bit by bit at first, then in big chunks, and his thoughts soon clash. What he learns is never what he pictured or imagined, and so he begins to be afraid. Learning is never what one expects. Every step of learning is a new task, and the fear the man is experiencing begins to mount mercilessly, unyieldingly. His purpose becomes a battlefield. And thus he has stumbled upon the first of his natural enemies, fear, a terrible enemy, treacherous and difficult to overcome. It remains concealed at every turn of the way, prowling, waiting. And if the man, terrified in its presence, runs away, his enemy will have put an end to his quest. Okay. And then he talks about confronting fear. And look, yeah, right? I mean, you might not become a Yaki sorcerer, but you do got to get your fear figured out at some point, folks, right? Okay.
That's what becoming an adult is.
Yeah, it really is. Now here's the next one. Quote, once a man has vanquished fear, he is free from it for the rest of his life because instead of fear, he has acquired clarity of mind which erases fear. By then, a man knows his desires. He knows how to satisfy these desires. He can anticipate the new steps of learning, and a sharp clarity surrounds everything. The man feels that nothing is concealed, and thus he has encountered his second enemy, clarity. That clarity of mind, which is so hard to obtain, dispels fear, but it also binds. It forces the man never to doubt himself. It gives him the assurance he can do anything he pleases, for he sees clearly into everything. And he is courageous because he is clear, and he stops at nothing because he is clear. But all that is a mistake. It is like something incomplete. If the man yields to this make-believe power, he has succumbed to his second enemy and will be patient when he should rush, and he will fumble with learning until he winds up incapable of learning anything more. Okay, and then a little bit later, what do you do about this clarity? Quote, he must do what he did with fear. He must defy his clarity and use it only to see and wait patiently and measure carefully before taking new steps. He must think, above all, that his clarity is almost a mistake. And a moment will come when he will understand that his clarity was only a point before his eyes. And thus he will overcome his second enemy and will arrive at a position where nothing can harm him anymore. This will not be a mistake. It will not be only a point before his eyes. It will be true power. Right now, what is the next enemy? Power. That's now you're powerful. Now that's a great way to become corrupted spiritually, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, is to become powerful, right? So there's that, and then the final one is old age. So Don Juan steps him through. These are the enemies that you're going to have to confront, and then Carlos goes through confronting these throughout the books. Now, the question I want us to be thinking about, not Carlos in the book, but Carlos in real life. Which of these did Carlos succumb to? I'm going to say that he did not succumb to fear. I think he got through fear. But as we're listening, think about fear, clarity, power, old age. Which one got him? I think it's an
this guy landed in California in the 50s and the 60s. Mm-hmm. He was right where he needed to be.
Oh yeah,
at the right time.
Oh yeah,
to pull off some monumental flim flam. I love it.
Oh yes. Now we get into talking about some of this. I want to give you a taste of some of the sort of drug stuff, because this is largely what this book is about. It's about doing drugs and, having experiences from it. Here's a bit about gyms and weed. Quote, this is Don Juan's words. Don Juan, the fictional character created by Carlos Castaneda. We may get a little hate. I even got a little bit of pushback from some people on Twitter about the fact that Don Juan was real. Yeah, literally, there's no corroboration. The only person who ever said they met Don Juan was Carlos Castaneda and a couple of his witches later. The witches show up later. Okay. Quote, you like flattery, he's talking to Carlos, and the devil's weed flatters you. Like a woman, she makes you feel good. The smoke is the mushrooms. The smoke, on the other hand, is the most noble power. He has the purest heart. He does not entice men or make them prisoners, nor does he love or hate. All he requires is strength. The devil's weed also requires strength, but of a different kind. It is closer to being virile with women. On the other hand, the strength required by the smoke is strength of the heart. You don't have that. But then again, very few men do have it. That is why I recommend that you learn more about the smoke. He reinforces the heart. He is not like the devil's weed, full of passions, jealousies, and violence. The smoke is constant. You don't have to worry about forgetting something along the line. Okay. So that's just a little bit about kind of what these things are like. Now, it's not just drugs, because purportedly Don Juan, and I should mention, His name is, according to Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan Matus. Now, he would at sometimes say that this was not actually his name, and this is just what he called him. But it should be noted that Carlos's favorite wine was Matus wine, the same name. The name of the wine and the last name of his purported mentor was the same. So there's a little bit, Margaret Runyon sort of says he concocted Don Juan Matus while drinking a bunch of Matus wine. Right.
This is like the end of The Usual Suspects.
Yeah.
Don Juan.
Yeah.
Glug, glug, glug.
Right. Now, it's not just about the whole path to becoming a man of knowledge isn't just about doing drugs. There's a whole hierarchy of actions and different kinds of magic that Carlos Castaneda is supposed to learn. One of them, these things is really kind of strange. You're supposed to capture these two lizards, right? You sew one's mouth shut, you sew the other one's eyes shut, and then you contemplate something you need the answer to do a bit of divination. You put the blind lizard on your shoulder, and you send the lizard that's had its mouth sewn shut out to go find the answer, and it's going to telepathically communicate the lizard, which is going to then whisper the answer into your ear.
Oh, they're freaking doing so many drugs, man. Yeah. So many drugs.
Yeah. There's all and then there's all kinds of things about gathering the drugs, right? Like you're only supposed to pick the mushrooms with a specific hand, either the left hand or the right hand. There's like a whole procedure about how you're supposed to gather them. The peyote buttons, you're not supposed to if you're walking along, you can't hunt for them. What you're supposed to do is like walk along and then just notice them and then walk back the same route, and then they appear to you. Like it's this subtle thing where you're sort of trying to trick Mescalito into like not thinking you are too earnest, sort of. There's all of these weird practices that Don Juan is like very specific and very rigorous about how you're supposed to do every step of this sorcery.
Well, and this gets to be very curious too, because how much of this is just folk knowledge that he gathered along the way and amalgamated into a single character.
Yeah,
there has to be some truth in here. It isn't entirely fabricated.
Yeah, and we're going to get to where did this all come from? Okay, so if Don Juan's not real, which it doesn't seem like he was, then how does Carlos Castaneda have this information? We're definitely going to talk about that. The big event, I think, there's two big events that were, I think, the most evocative in the book for people. One was the bit about him turning into a crow. I was going to read it. I think I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, what happens is he takes the smoke, which is he smokes mushrooms. Which, by the way, you don't smoke mushrooms. For people out there, it's just not how you do them. Castaneda maybe didn't know that. It's not clear. Anyway, he does it, and he almost becomes a crow the first time, and then the second time he does become a crow, and he flies around, and he ends up in a ditch someplace, and he has to be sort of like nursed back to reality. And there's a whole bit about Carlos asking Don Juan, "Did I really fly like a crow?" And Don Juan's sort of basically saying, "That's not the right question. You had the experience of flying like a crow." It's this whole thing, like Carlos is playing with the notion of like, is it real or not? It's the significance of the experience. And in a way, I think he's talking about the book itself. I think he's subtly just telling you that was Don Juan real? And he's sort of saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter if Don Juan's real. It doesn't really matter if he turned into a crow and flew, right?
Yeah, these con artists, there's a part of them that always kind of wants to get caught. They kind of want it. They get off on letting you know that they're pissing on your hair in the theater.
Right. Yeah,
they kind of do. This is a noticeable criminal, sociopathic, psychopathic con artist tendency. And the con artists that I've encountered in my various walks of life, they tend to leave enough crumbs that if you're really looking at it, they want to rub it in a little bit.
Well, because
they're smarter. They're smarter than you.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing you think about Carlos. It's like this dude was smart. Like there's no mess around. He's a smart dude. It is funny though that people describe how wonderfully written this book is.
It's garbage.
I think
It's
the sequence of events is kind of interestingly done, but like it's not captivating reading on a sentence by sentence level.
It's totally basically hack. It's hot garbage. We were having a chat in the Art of Darkness Telegram at t.me/Art of Dark Pod recently about style. And nobody, if you're reading Castaneda for the quality of the prose, you're missing the point.
Yeah, that's not what it's for. Yeah. There is an interesting scene that I did find.
Did a crow write this?
Right. There is a scene late in the teachings of Don Juan that I did find actually compelling as a scene. And what happens is Don Juan teaches Carlos some defensive positions in case he is sort of attacked on the spiritual plane, right?
You do see how funny this is, of course, right? Like this is an episode of It's Always Sunny.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, go on. So he's learning some astral jujitsu.
Yeah, right. But then what happens, and then Don Juan disappears, leaves Carlos in his house, and later that night, at like midnight, Don Juan shows back up, but it's not Don Juan. It looks like him, but his mannerisms and the way he holds himself and his posture and his voice aren't right. And so Carlos knows that this is some kind of spiritual attack and he has to defend himself. And it turns out that this is some witch that basically has it out for Don Juan and is trying to kill his apprentice. Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a powerful female sorcerer who's a rival of Don Juan.
He's doing all these like astral kata in his mind.
Yeah.
That fucking rocks.
Right. Now this is the question. Okay, we did touch on why did this appeal to people, and I don't think that's that hard to understand why it actually appealed to people. What is a more interesting question, I think, is how the hell did he get away with it? Right? How do you get away with this passing, peer review or at any kind of academic process whatsoever? Right? There's a whole bunch of reasons. We're going to go into it. We're going to go into a few of them. One reason that we'll talk about in a few, it's not my first reason, but just to tease it, and it's somebody that AoD listeners will know, Anais Nin, who was a close friend of Carlos Castaneda's. We'll talk more about that in a second. Another big one, probably the biggest one, why he was able to get away with it at first anyway, is this guy named Harold Garfinkel. Harold Garfinkel was a well-known UCLA sociology professor, a man whose penchant for phenomenological thinking and Husserl and his development of a field of study called ethno-methodology was as much of an influence on Castaneda as any drug could have possibly been. This Harold Garfinkel guy is really pretty interesting. We could do an entire episode on him, to be honest.
This guy was friends with Anais Nin too.
Yeah. Before he was well known. Like
once again, proof there are only 25,000 living people at any given time.
This episode might have the most mentions of other Art of Darkness subjects of any of them we've done.
It doesn't add up. If there are at this point, 3.54 billion people on the planet in the 60s. I don't know what the number was. Mm-hmm. It doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, right?
I really don't. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah. So this Garfinkel guy, I am really interested in Garfinkel, and I might do some more reading on him. Fascinating guy. He had his own cult-like following at UCLA, and Carlos, as people may know, later had a group of people around him who it was probably a cult, depending on your definition of cult.
The other American dream.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
There are two American dreams.
One's getting what's the first one?
The white picket fence.
Oh, yes.
The golden retriever.
Right. The second is a harem, and
the second is a cult.
Yeah.
That is, and I mean that.
Yeah.
Well, the girl boss cult, the straight up Manson cult, the CEO of your own startup cult. That's the other
I see.
American dream.
You're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now Harold Garfinkel was living out the cult one himself, though it wasn't like a Waco cult, but it was certainly, he had devoted followers, students who became followers. He he probably was a major inspiration for Don Juan. Yeah, go ahead.
Did Castaneda ever do a spoken word album?
No, he did not.
Okay,
No.
because he seems like a prime candidate for something like that.
He probably
but okay.
could have. He was quite a good talker. He probably could have pulled it off. He was a good storyteller too.
Well, you would have to be.
Yeah, yeah. Now Garfinkel was an influence on Castaneda in a number of ways. Probably one was he was a direct influence on for the character of Don Juan, and also I said in the After Dark for patreon.com/artofdarkpod. I have three things, and I teased one of them, and I don't know if I even remember what they were. One thing we're going to talk about is how the character of Don Juan, and this book in particular, directly entered the American mythology through a film series that continues to this day. Like, it's one-to-one inspiration for stuff still happening in Hollywood. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. Another thing we're going to talk about is what happened to the witches. Okay. Carlos Castaneda eventually develops this group of women around him called the Witches, and we're going to find out what exactly happened to them after Castaneda. It's a very interesting story. And the other one is what happened when Federico Fellini, the great Italian filmmaker, fell into Castaneda's sphere of influence. Also very interesting, very weird story.
Tremendous. I'm going to give you a quick break, Brad.
Oh.
We're doing great. This is a lot of fun. I'm going to give you a break, and I'm going to hammer the Patreon. Brad has 3 juicy tidbits prepared for the After Dark. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. We do an After Dark episode for every single episode that we do. We do these core episodes. We do dark rooms with guests. We always do an extra 20 or 30 minutes for Patreon. We also have a book club. If you sign up for Patreon, you get access to the book club. You can join us. We read different books. We all get on Zoom. We chat about it. You don't want to get on Zoom with other people, we record it. So you get an extra little bit there. You can just read along if you want, or you can just listen back. The next book club event is coming up on the 17th of this month. We're reading Confessions of a Mask from Mishima, the Weatherby translation. That is on September 17th, 2023. If you're listening to this in the future, you can get Patreon and just go back and listen to it. And those book club meetings are a lot of fun. We go into these books that are relevant to Art of Darkness or kind of Art of Darkness adjacent. And we've got a very special episode coming up at the end of the year. Aaron Gwynn, by popular demand, is coming back for the Blood Meridian Bookends Book Club Art of Darkness special in December.
And we might just have him read the entire book aloud.
He
does. He goes for it.
He is the Blood Meridian guy. So if you want that, we've also talked about changing the way that we release episodes. We're thinking next year, Patreon subscribers will get episodes the core episodes, a full week before the hoi polloi.
Right.
And you don't want to be part of the hoi polloi. No. Transmute yourself into a crow, fly over to patreon.com/artofdarkpod and join our cult. You will not regret it. There is no overhead for this pod. You're looking at if you're watching on YouTube, you're looking at the overhead. That's it. So, and a lot of people, and I'll get off this in a second, but a lot of people make a lot of noise about supporting artists, about supporting independent media, about looking after people who are actually making things. But then when it comes to swiping the credit card, they're too lazy, or they don't want to download another app. Just do it, because Brad and I put in the work. We put in the effort. We make this show. We love doing it. We want to do this for a very, very long time. The only way that is going to be sustainable is if we can get these Patreon numbers up in a really meaningful way. We said at the beginning of the year we were going for half a Crowley, 333 Patreon subscribers. We're not going to make it at the rate we're going. We're going to need a giga surge of Patreon. Now, we're not going to throw a fit if we don't make it, because we're going to make half a Crowley at some point. At some point, enough people are going to take the Jimson weed and fly into the Art of Darkness universe and join us in a material way. It's going to happen. At the rate we're going, it'll happen next year. We would love if it could happen this year. Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. All right, Carlos Castaneda. Brad, I'm loving this. I love these 1960s episodes. I love Flim Flam.
Yes.
I like cults. I like little like a microcosm of the 60s. I like when academia is just proven to be total horseshit.
right.
Which it's been forever. Like it's never none of it, like what's real, what's not. Don't look up the what's it called? The replication crisis. Don't think too much about it. Everything's gonna be okay. Just take your medicine and go to sleep.
Yes. Now, and on this note about academia, we're going to talk about the Harold Garfinkel, famed UCLA sociologist, and the field he invented called ethno-methodology. Now, you've heard of ethnography. You've heard of ethnobotany. What the heck is ethno-methodology? Well, this is from the life and teachings of Carlos Castaneda. Quote, the primary idea of ethno-methodology is that every kind of reality is subjective, or at least, quote, intersubjective. The result of people talking about things using language that signified their membership in a society or particular category of society. The fundamental practice of ethno-methodology was to question the unquestioned, to make a problem of what hitherto had been unproblematic. Before ethno-methodology, sociology and anthropology had focused on how members of a society interrelated. Garfinkel and his fellow ethnos put the focus on how sociologists and anthropologists themselves related to the society they were in the act of describing. According to Richard DeMille, the guy who wrote this book over here, a Castaneda debunker familiar with what was going on, he says this, quote, Garfinkel thought up some diabolical schemes for calling assumptions into question, techniques labeled breaching procedures because they tore holes in people's shared understandings and disrupted their social relations. Students went home on vacation with instructions to act like boarders. They were told to conduct conversations as though they suspected the other person were trying to trick or mislead them. They learned to talk with people whose noses their noses were almost touching. They were authorized to mistake people's social roles, like persistently demanding a table in a full restaurant from a person who was only another unseated customer. And in a technique that was soon dubbed Garfinkeling on the UCLA campus, students were taught to pretend they didn't know the meaning of ordinary words. This was to teach the breachers that human interactions, particularly conversations, depended on shared but unstable assumptions. Okay, breaching. Now I'm going to read another little bit. Arnold Mandel.
I'm Garfinkeling all the time. I'm a natural.
I do like some of those sound fun, like pretending you don't know the meaning of an ordinary word. Like that sounds pretty fun. I might try that at a party if I got bored. Just like what's a spoon? Like wait,
what is an e-girl? What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about.
Right. A girl, but
she did what?
Yeah.
You bought what online? From a what?
That might not actually be breaching. That might be genuine confusion.
You paid what for what from a what? Here, let me smell it.
Right. Here's a little bit more on Garfinkeling and all this. Quote, Arnold Mandel, a former student of Garfinkel's, now a psychiatry professor at UC San Diego, thinks that in the end, what Castaneda did was to give Garfinkel just what he wanted. So when Castaneda comes back with this book, Teachings of Don Juan, this book is breaching. This is a big breach. You're basically disrupting the whole notion of anthropology overall, right? Quote, said Richard DeMille, quote, Mandel suspected that in making Castaneda rewrite an intended thesis 3 times, Garfinkel had imposed his ethnographic nihilism so ruthlessly that the wily graduate student, Castaneda, had determined to go him one better, to out-Garfinkel, to prepare a beautifully wrapped empty package, a bogus thesis, a fake ethnography, which would achieve continuity and a sense of reality, thereby demonstrating the student's capacity to manipulate ethno-methodological tools without contradicting the master's teaching that all reality in social science was manufactured by social scientists. Going on. But DeMille...
You got Garfinkel, son.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Oh, I'm not going to read that bit. We will come back to that. So a little bit more. Yeah. The reason I'm going into this is I think whatever the case, whether Castaneda was trying to out Garfinkel, or if he was actually seeing himself as the true disciple of Garfinkel, it's not entirely clear. But what is happening is, I think he got, at least partially, he got this notion of like, oh, this doesn't have to be facts. Like it can be all nonsense, right?
Well, and this all is downstream of philosophy and postmodernism and Wittgenstein and all of that. So this is the fallout of all of that philosophy. Hitting the other fields and people going, oh, so it's all language games, huh?
Yes. And it's interesting you say Wittgenstein, because there is people, DeMille in particular, and we're going to look at a few examples. I don't want to go to spend too much time on it. It gets a little repetitive, but a lot of the things that Don Juan says in the books is literally just like paraphrased Wittgenstein or paraphrase somebody else,
probably Schopenhauer and others.
Just take it, rewrite it a little bit and send it back out. And that sounds very wise. And you're like, yeah, it's because it's written by one of the great philosophers of human history. Here's something from Carlos talking right around the time that Teachings of Don Juan came out. Quote, "We have a picture of the world that has been given to us through socialization. And then we have and I'm just giving you this because this is basically pure Harold Garfinkel thinking. We have a picture of the world that has been given to us through socialization, and then we have a preconception about what the world is like, and we call that reality. We assume it's there. We never doubt that. However, under very precarious circumstances, we get to doubt." So this is what Don Juan's doing. Don Juan is basically doing what Garfinkel to Carlos. The Richard DeMille actually treats Carlos in the books as a character that he calls Carlos. He distinguishes it from Carlos Castaneda, the man, which I think is the right move. Don Juan is doing to the character Carlos what Garfinkel was doing to Carlos Castaneda in real life, really sort of pushing him. And there is. It's not that it's completely BS. I mean, I do think it's worth examining, like, how much your preconceptions determine the social reality, right? Like, there is something interesting does happen when you try to just stress test social roles. Yeah. What happens if have you ever done this, or have it happen to you, where you're in a store and somebody asks you, suddenly they think you work there for some reason?
All the time. You never wear red in Target, for example.
Yeah, and it's very weird, because for me, if it happens, I have this weird urge to help them, but I have no ability to. You know what I mean? You're like, well, because somebody asked you for something you should. And so there is something there about playing with these ideas of like, who are we? How are we relating to each other? But doing it as a prolonged experiment to see how much you can manipulate people is in sociopathic territory.
Ethically dubious.
Yes.
You're on strange ground, and yet it does point to some underlying facts about our reality and how much of our reality is absolutely a social construct. And a game. It's games within games within games within games.
And I think there is a what I have noticed in the discourse right now is there's a re-examination of all of these sort of, let's just broadly call this postmodern thinking, and it's trying to kind of throw that stuff out, but there is something there. Like, a lot of the quote unquote truths that we operate on are sort of just tacit agreement stuff that we sort of all kind of agreed on without talking about it.
Anybody who's ever quit a job that has turned into some sort of insane psychodrama, you know how you get into these weird psychodramas at work? Not necessarily through any fault of your own. It's just human nature. Something goes wrong. The boss gets an idea about you. Somebody else gets an idea. You have ideas about them. Everybody knows it's happening, but nobody says anything. And you quit, or you get fired. And a week later, your life is completely changed because you simply stepped out of one of the most dominant games that you're playing.
Right.
And it's like, wait a minute, the sun's still shining on a Tuesday at 1:00. The world hasn't ended, but you've been dragged into this.
Kind of and a month later, you don't even remember their names.
And,
you're like,
and you don't even. Yeah, quitting bad jobs is probably like my third or fourth favorite thing. I love it. Nothing gives me more pleasure.
Right.
I love it.
Well, there
I
is something
quit.
because it turns the power.
Say it with
tables.
me.
Yeah.
I quit. I
Yeah.
fucking quit. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And I'll let you guess what my three favorite things are, Brad. One of them is doing this podcast for you good people.
No, that's
all
sweet.
right. Yeah, we love doing Art of Darkness. And yes, and thank you for listening. And also one quick thing: go and 5-star us, iTunes, Spotify. Hit it up. That counts. People look at the pod and they go, "Ooh, it's got 100 plus 5 stars." What did I?
Yeah,
it gives it credibility. We need credibility. We appreciate it. Share the pod with your friends. We're making this show to go viral. And people need to know about Carlos Castaneda. I need to know about Carlos Castaneda. This is filling in some holes for me. I'm having a really good, I'm having a lot of fun, Brad. It's fun.
Good. Now, I'm kind of trying to weave these things together. We're talking about how did Carlos Castaneda get away with it? And that is, how did he get this approved as his master's thesis? How did UCLA, the whole program, the whole school go for it? How did it?
You know what? My guess right now, oral sex. That's my guess.
I mean, if that's all you do, you get pretty good at it.
Yeah. Yeesh. Well, he is in LA. But let's be real.
Yeah. So the one reason I'm kind of saying is this Teachings of Don Juan book is almost a natural result of Harold Garfinkel. This whole practice that's going on at UCLA. It's sort of a logical conclusion of something like Garfinkeling, right? So that's one way. Another thing.
Yeah, it's a feature, not a bug. They're playing with reality itself. And what does anything mean?
Yeah. So then what you're going to take, and then Castaneda is literally Garfinkel's best, most dedicated student. And what he's going to write a book that's completely true. Like it would make less sense if it was completely true when you see it through this Garfinkel lens, I think. Another reason that it probably passed muster is, look, it's 1968. It's the counterculture is in full swing. Drugs, the UCLA institution, frankly, wants to be hip, right? You want to appeal to the undergraduates. You want to, there's cool stuff happening. We got this guy here. He goes out into the desert with a shaman and he's doing drugs out there. Like they don't want, you don't want to mess that up, man. There's a little bit of a countercultural cachet that comes with that. And you don't want to disturb that. We're just going to let Castaneda do his thing. Hey, Garfinkel says it's okay. So let's just publish it. Hit print on that thing, right? So that's part of it. Now, another thing that you can't be denied is the power of Castaneda's personality. Okay. If you have a powerful personality, and again, you've overcome the enemy of fear, right? Which I think Castaneda does, and you're incredibly charismatic and you make good arguments. You can get a lot done. And I'm going to read you a little bit on this again from The Life and Teachings of Carlos Castaneda. Very good. This is a very good book, by the way, if you're interested in this kind of thing. This is after the UCLA print run of Teachings of Don Juan. It got picked up by Simon & Schuster, and then it went national. And Castaneda's editor was this guy, Michael Korda. And this is what Korda had. This is what Korda... When Korda and Castaneda first met, they met in the parking lot of this diner, and Castaneda walked right up to him and said, "You're Michael Korda." And Michael Korda said, "How did you know?" And this is from Castaneda. "I'm a sorcerer," Castaneda said mischievously. "How could I miss you? Of course, it didn't hurt that Ned described you to me." Right? Okay, going on. Korda would later write of his impression saying this: "I have seldom, if ever, liked anybody so much so quickly, a feeling that remains undiminished after more than 25 years. It wasn't so much what Castaneda had to say as his presence, a kind of charm that was partly subtle intelligence, partly real affection for people, and partly a kind of innocence, not of the naive kind, but of the kind one likes to suppose saints, holy men, prophets, and gurus have. Castaneda's spirit was definitely Rabelaisian and ribald, and he had a wicked sense of humor. But nevertheless, he gave off in some way the authentic, potent whiff of otherworldly power, to such a degree that I have never doubted for a moment the truth of his stories about Don Juan, or of the miracles he says he witnessed and later participated in." That was his editor. That was a big shot Simon & Schuster editor, right? So, you imagine that guy comes in, he throws his book on your desk, and it's sort of like, whew, he just sort of just convinces you. He just like he convinces this woman to marry him while she's on a date with somebody else, right? He can just make these things happen. And there's a certain magic in that, right? There's a certain sorcereric power in being able to do that. So that's another reason why this was able to get through. And this doesn't, we didn't touch on the fact that academia has all of these. If you can, it's a game, and if you know how to play it, then you can make some things happen.
Well, and publishing is such a racket. If you have something that's starting to sell and you found the formula to sell it, you're not going to change a thing. Right. You are going to scale that, put it in every bookstore, send them on a speaking tour. Right. And you're going to say, write 12 more of these. Right. Because the Pareto principle in publishing is huge. It's all
they sold 28 million. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's a crazy amount.
I want you to think about this. 20 million copies worldwide.
28. Yeah.
28 million copies worldwide. We're talking about like a #1 album, best-selling, crazy. Probably half of those in the United States alone.
Something like that.
Some number. You have to understand how many millions of people are walking around with this flim-flammery, this fabrication in their minds, and how we're living in the wake of this. Like, look around at the world now. Look at the state of things now. The state of capital T truth, lowercase t truth. What is reality? We will never live to see a day where the fallout of this is not among the most important facts of contemporary American life for millennials, for Zoomers. The generation where this won't matter anymore has yet to be born.
Right.
We are still deconstructing and trying to understand what the fuck happened in the 60s. Nothing has changed since the late 60s. The only thing that's changed is the technology of transmittal. But the technology of transmittal was deeply informed and influenced by this. Steve Jobs, what was it? The Whole Earth catalog, that whole milieu were completely inspired and enamored of this type of thing.
100%.
And it influences practically everything around us.
Yeah.
The way we live our lives, the way we think about our lives, the way we, in any case. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Art of Darkness. I like thinking about the 60s a lot.
Right.
Brad.
It's an interesting, it's fascinating period. No doubt.
We're never going to get past it. Nothing will happen in our lifetimes that will fully pull us out of the spiritual quagmire, the 60s, particularly the late 60s signifies.
Indeed.